It up then, I'll open up. Okay, welcome. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is William Robinson. I'm a professor of sociology, global studies, and Latin American studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And I'm also a member of the working group on the Nicaraguan crisis, which is one of the two organizations sponsoring this event tonight. I want to give a shout out to my fellow working group members. And I also want to give a shout out to my colleagues at Latin American Perspectives, which just published a special symposium that I edited on the Nicaraguan crisis. The working group that I'm representing tonight was formed earlier this year by a group of us who had worked in the 1980s in the Nicaraguan Foreign Ministry or in other Sandinista agencies, and or those of us who had taught at Nicaragua universities in recent decades. And we formed this group late last spring, because we were deeply concerned about the escalation of repression against those that are opposed to the Ortega Murillo regime. We're opponents of this regime. That is our working group. Here I have to stress that I'm not speaking for our co-sponsor, NACLA, who is here as a forum for debate and disagreement. But we in the working group are opposed to the regime, and we are opposed to it specifically from a leftist perspective. It's clear to us that the Nicaraguan crisis has deeply divided the left in the United States and throughout the hemisphere. And we're deeply concerned that the traditional Nicaraguan right wing is exercising hegemony over the opposition inside Nicaragua, but more significantly, it's this right-wing discourse which is exercising hegemony internationally. Its voice is heard. So we proposed organizing this forum because we wanted to give a voice to a leftist perspective and debate on the crisis in Nicaragua. So with that as context, I want to thank our panelists, our esteemed panelists, and I'm going to introduce them. Our featured speaker is Luis Carrion Cruz. He was a guerrilla commander during the struggle against the Somoza dictatorship, and then a member of the National Directorate of the Sandinista National Liberation Front with the title of Comandante de la Revolución, Commander of the Revolution. He served during the 1980s as Deputy Minister of the Interior and later as Minister of the Economy, Industry, and Commerce. He's one of the founding members and key leaders of the Sandinista Renovation Movement, which recently changed its name to the Democratic Renovation Movement, known by its acronyms UNAMOS. Earlier this year, he was forced into exile in the wake of the wave of repression that I mentioned, which was very much directed against UNAMOS members. Then after Luis speaks, we have two discussants, two esteemed discussants. Margaret Randle is a feminist poet, writer, and revolutionary activist with a long history of political involvement in Mexico, in Cuba, and in Nicaragua. She met with and collaborated with many Sandinista leaders who passed through Cuba before the 1979 triumph of the revolution. And then she herself moved to and lived in Nicaragua from 1979 to 1984 and worked with the revolution. Among her many books, way too vast to list here, is her critically acclaimed 1981 work, Sandino's Daughters. In fact, it was in 1981 that I myself read that book and I first met Margaret in Managua. That work was followed up in 1994 by Sandino's Daughters Revisited, Feminism in Nicaragua. In 2020, she published I Never Left Home, Poet, Feminist, Revolutionary, which specifically has a chapter on the time that she spent in Nicaragua. Our second discussant is Leonard Zuniga. She is a Nicaraguan sociologist, documentary filmmaker, and cinematographer. She also holds advanced degrees from Georgetown University, Stanford University, and Goldsmiths University in London, and she's a Fulbright scholar. She is co-founder of Calais Producciones, a Nicaraguan film production company dedicated to communication for social change that has produced several feature films. Leonard has also directed several short films, including most recently Exiliada, a story of Sol America Ortega in her own words. Her films have been selected for screening in many prestigious film festivals, and she also serves as a film professor and is co-founder of a series of film workshops in Nicaragua and in in Mexico, and she's published a number of essays on youth political culture, communications media, and democracy in Nicaragua. And finally, I want to introduce our esteemed moderator and co-host for tonight, Alejandro Velasco. Alejandro is executive editor of the North American Congress on Latin America's publication, NACLA Report on the Americas, which, as many of you know, has been a beacon of left and progressive coverage of Latin America in English, and now trilingually, in fact, since 1966. He is also a history professor at New York University, specializing in modern Latin American history, and is author of the critically acclaimed book, Barrio Rising, Urban Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. So with that, thank you again to our panelists for being present, and to all of you who are have zoomed in. And with that, I will turn over to our co-host and moderator for tonight, Alejandro.
Thanks so much, William, and thank you everyone for joining into this webinar. I'm very excited to be able to moderate, and really honored to be able to participate, even just in a small role in this discussion. I'm only slightly a bit offended, William, that you didn't mention the most important part of your own bio, which is that you also sit on the board of NACLA. But that's okay. I'll just leave that to the side. And in fact, we have, of course, as William mentioned, been publishing continuously since 1966 from the left to shed a light on social movements and solidarity movements in the region. Of course, the task has never been easy. Certainly it wasn't in 1966, and it isn't today. There are many, many complexities to think about in the context of Latin American left movements, governments, etc. And as William kindly mentioned, our role really is one of fostering and promoting debate among left. And so you, for instance, will find a recent two article series from William on Nicaragua. Margaret also recently published a piece on Cuba in the wake of the protests that happened there over the summer. And there's significant debate, as everyone on the left in the United States understands, and that is what NACLA tries to promote. And so we're very honored to be able to participate and to co-host this event. Thank you, William and the working group, for inviting us to do so. I will say very briefly that as William already suggested, the order of the event will be Luis speaking for about 25 minutes or so. Then Margaret and Leonard will each have about 15 minutes to respond to Luis. And then we will open up for questions and answers, which we are asking all of you who are participating as attendees to do in the question and answer function of Zoom. And I will moderate those questions as they come. After we open up that opportunity for discussion. I might also interject some questions of my own, as might William. And we hope to have a debate de altura, and so we encourage everyone to bring that perspective to their own engagement. So with that, I think I will open it up to Luis to start us off with your comments. Luis.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you to all who made this event possible. And thank you to all who have been, who connected themselves this evening. Let me start by saying that in Nicaragua, there is no second phase of the revolution. The Sandinista revolution ended with the defeat suffered by the FSLN in 1990. When Ortega came back to power in 2007, he was clearly determined to never leave it again. His motivations were not revolutionary, but dictatorial and dynastic. His politics were anti-democratic and his economic policies were conservative. To obscure these facts, he and his wife are spreading lies trying to convince the world otherwise. Lie number one, Ortega's government is a progressive one, or as its motto says, socialist, Christian, and solidarity. False. Ortega's government is capitalist, free market, and extremely conservative in social issues. Ortega has pursued neoliberal economic policies since he came back to power and created the most favorable conditions for foreign capital to come to Nicaragua, particularly for the production of energy and mining. Transnational and other foreign companies have opened doors, including the highly exploitative maquilas, lured by tax exemptions, low wages, and controlled labor unions. His government was such a good practitioner of the Washington Consensus that it has received praise from the IMF and the World Bank for his free market and pro-capitalist policies. As a consequence, Ortega's government has had free access to funds from these institutions and the Banco Centroamericano de Integración Económica, even when the killings were going on. Along these years, the US representatives in this institution have not blocked a single disbursement of funds to the Ortega's government. Strategic alliance with big business has been a cornerstone of Ortega's politics. The wealthy businessmen, as a result of this pact, obtain social and economic conditions to maximize their earnings, i.e., domesticated labor unions or no unions at all, economic policies agreeable to their interests, millionaire tax exemptions, among others. Their support, on the other hand, gave Ortega respectability in the eyes of international financial institutions and capitalist governments, international political legitimacy, since he was no longer a fierce revolutionary, but a pragmatic leader, and powerful allies to lobby in his favor in Washington corridors. Every economic policy was agreed upon in secretive bilateral talks, while the National Assembly was reduced to rubber stamping whatever deal came out of those talks. This arrangement with the oligarchs was so fundamental that it was inscribed in the country's constitution as the model of dialogue and consensus. Ortega's corrupt association with big business won him their complicit silence as he systematically undermined political institutions, restricted individual rights, and organized electoral frauds. Because of these policies and political arrangements, the rich got richer, not only old money, but also a new class of capitalists, the Orteguista capitalists, who emerged as a result of state corruption and multimillionaire subsidies provided by the Venezuelan government. These subsidies were privately appropriated by Ortega and his cronies and used to set up a gigantic private corporation called Albaniza with shady businesses in every sector of the economy that were propelled by government contracts. On the social front, his policies were also highly conservative. Ortega and Murillo have a pseudo-religious and esoteric discourse. They use religion as a way to gain favor and even organize religious festivities in competition with the Catholic Church, all in an effort to convince people that they are chosen by God to preside over the country. Their government has constantly harassed women's movements. They joined forces with the most conservative groups to make abortion for sanitary reasons illegal, allied themselves with extremist right-wing evangelical churches, and Ortega even invited one of Trump's religious counselors to last year's celebration of the anniversary of the revolution. Lie number 2, Ortega and Murillo's government is a popular one. Not true. The government of Ortega and his wife Murillo is a cruel and corrupt dynastic dictatorship bent on remaining in power indefinitely by any means possible. They control all state institutions, especially the Electoral Council, the police force, the army, and the judiciary, and use them as extensions of themselves. At the head of all of these institutions, they have put fierce loyalists and even members of their family, like the head of the police, who is an in-law. With the help of the Supreme Court, Ortega managed to circumvent the constitutional prohibition for re-election and later reform the Constitution to allow him to remain in power indefinitely. While doing this, the dictatorship moved to eliminate all meaningful opposition, beginning with the banning of the Democratic left-wing party MRS, Movimiento Renovador Sandinista, which was originally founded by former Sandinista leaders and other members committed to upholding the values and principles of the revolution in a democratic context. Later, in 2016, just before national elections were held, they banned the Independent Liberal Party, PLI, with whom the MRS had made an electoral alliance, and illegally expelled its elected representatives out of the National Assembly. It is telling that the former PLI was granted legal personality the following year under the name of Ciudadanos por la Libertad in exchange for breaking up the relationship with MRS. Through these maneuvers, plus electoral fraud and corruption of some party leaders, Ortega made it almost impossible to hold free and competitive elections in Nicaragua, thus closing down the possibility for a real opposition party to participate in the electoral process, let alone winning. Nicaragua has lived for more than 3 years already under a de facto state of emergency. There are more than 150 political prisoners, including the most prominent opposition leaders of all walks of life. Several media outlets have been closed, journalists are harassed, and many have been forced to leave the country. Tens of civic organizations have been proscribed and dissolved. Most media outlets have been closed down or are controlled by the dictatorship. Thousands of people cannot leave the country and their passports have been sequestered. Many others are continuously harassed by the police in their own houses. Most members of the National Executive Committee of UNAMOS are among the prisoners. People like Dora Maria Tellez, revolutionary hero and former health minister, Hugo Torres, who risked his life to rescue Daniel Ortega from Somoza's prisons in 1974, and Victor Hugo Tinoco, former vice minister of foreign relations. All of them and more than 30 other relevant prisoners are being tortured in an attempt to demoralize them and to get them to incriminate themselves in the crimes of which they are being accused. In Nicaragua, there is no freedom of expression, no freedom of organization, no freedom to travel, no freedom at all. Ortega and Murillo are governing by means of fear and the use of force. Line number 3, Nicaragua will hold legitimate elections in November 2021 with the participation of many opposition parties. Not true. The coming elections will be totally farcical. Not only Ortega has eliminated all potential competition, but he also controls the Electoral Council and all of the electoral structures down to the voting booth. The law was reformed against all recommendation of the OES. Public gatherings are prohibited during the campaign, arguing that the COVID epidemic makes it necessary. That from the government that hides information about the pandemic and promotes massive meetings and activities, and many other restrictions. Almost all of the presidential aspirants have been thrown in jail and 3 opposition parties have been banned, eliminating in that way any possible opposition. The so-called opposition parties that will take part in this farce are close associates of the dictatorship, including the PLC, Partido Liberal Constitucionalista, whose head made a pact with Ortega in 1999 that made it possible for him to win elections in 2006 with less than 38% of the votes. Aside from the PLC, the other participants are minuscule parties, Ortega's puppets, and the only reason that they exist is for Ortega to claim that he is not running alone. In November, there will be voting, but no elections, because the people will not have the possibility to choose a candidate or a party different from Ortega and the FSLN. The coming election is practically a one-party election with a foregone result. Ortega will proclaim himself as president for the 4th time in a row, and Murillo as vice president for the 2nd time in a row. There will be no surprises because everything has been arranged for there to be none. In no way the results of that so-called election will have legitimacy. They will only serve to badly disguise the forceful overtaking of power by Ortega, Murillo, and his friends. If there was a coup in Nicaragua, it is the one already perpetrated by Ortega. Line number 4. All was well in Nicaragua until terrorists staged an attempt at a coup in 2018. False. The 2018 civic rebellion was not an attempt at a coup, and Ortega and his cronies will have you, to believe, but a spontaneous popular uprising due to grievances that have been accumulating for years, very much like the uprisings that occurred in other parts of Latin America. Venezuelan funds dried up, which limited his ability to finance clientelist programs. Consecutive electoral frauds, selective repression of popular movements, the shameful agreement with the Chinese capitalists to build a canal in violation of national sovereignty, the colonization of lands belonging to indigenous people, which led to killings, continued control of a student organization, among other factors, put increasing pressure on the regressed model of government. By the end of 2017, it was ready to explode sooner or later. In April 2018, this explosion occurred. Initial protests started as a reaction to a reform to the Social Security law required by the IMF, but what made the civic uprising to grow exponentially was the brutal repression by the police and armed thugs. As a response, indignant students took over universities' buildings, and after that, young people from all over the country and organized peasants put up barricades and roadblocks to defend themselves, while multitudinary marches took to the streets. But from the beginning of the protests, the killings started. Many of them occurred during the development of peaceful marches and went on for several months until they reached more than 300 dead, plus many hundreds wounded and more than 800 prisoners. People's indignations and anger only grew, and demands increased rapidly. Very soon, protesters were claiming for Ortega to resign, which later changed to ask for early elections as a way to solve the crisis by civic and democratic means. These were obviously legitimate demands. There was no overarching organization or leadership behind the uprising. Hundreds of groups sprang up and coordinated action using social media. It was totally a grassroots movement with no coherent plan or strategy to achieve the ousting of Ortega. It was so much so that when Ortega called for talks, there was nobody who could represent or had ascendancy over the movement, and the Catholic Episcopal Conference was charged with the task of creating counterpart. The blue and white movement always proclaimed its commitment to peaceful means of struggle and acted in consequence, never sought to get weapons, neither supported armed struggle, never condoned violence, but most important, it did not have any influence whatsoever in the army or the police force, which were the only institution with the power to enact a coup. The civic and pacific nature of the struggle has been underlined by the fact that all of the leaders now in prison waited in their houses for the security forces to arrive and gave themselves up with no resistance. Ortega's accusation that there was an attempt at a coup are ridiculous and completely false. He's not the victim. He is the executioner. All the coup talk is just a smokescreen to justify the brutal repression against all opposition groups and individuals that has been his trademark. Lie number 5. The US is trying to overthrow Ortega's government. The history of US intervention in Nicaragua is one of the worst in the Americas. Most, if not all, of those interventions were disastrous for the Nicaraguan people, who paid tremendous costs as a result. The United States usually intervened politically and militarily in favor of the most conservative forces or to support dictatorship as the Somozas. It is only natural then that some people today tend to believe Ortega's narrative that is going on in Nicaragua is a destabilization plan orchestrated by the US government to overthrow him because of his anti-imperialist stand and his defense of national sovereignty. But this is not exactly true. To begin with, Ortega is not truly an anti-imperialist. Relations with US government from 2007 until 2017 were reasonably friendly. Ortega addressed what US cared most about: migration and drug trafficking. Ortega blocked the crossing of migrants seeking to reach the United States and established full cooperation with DEA and friendly relations with the Southern Command. When in addition, we considered his alliance with big business and his pro-capitalist policies, it is clear that the US had no reason to be hostile to his government. During all these years, he toned down his anti-imperialist and anti-American rhetoric as US grew to become the most important commercial partner of Nicaragua. Today, he has gone back to a fiery anti-imperialism as a way to justify his crackdown on the democratic opposition groups and to secure support from left-wing governments and others who are justifiably suspicious of US intention. But so far, neither Ortega's government nor his supporters have been able to produce direct proof of US involvement in the planning and organizing of the civic insurrection of 2018, not even after they have held illegally in prison the leaders of the alleged conspiracy for more than 100 days. I do not deny that some of of them may have received funds to help victims of the repression or to better organize themselves or to finance opposition activities after the 2018 civic insurrection. But that doesn't amount to treason, especially when you are fighting against a dictatorship accused of crimes against humanity that trounces all individual rights and kills its own people. It neither means they were acting on behalf of foreign interests. There were more than enough legitimate reasons for the people of Nicaragua to rise against the dictatorship. To receive external support for a pacific and legitimate struggle does not alter the nature of the struggle, just as the revolutionary nature of the struggle against Somoza in the late 1970s was not corrupted because the FSLN received support from different countries, or as Ortega did not consider himself a puppet because Gaddafi funded his electoral campaigns. Others, like the UNAMOS leadership and other organizations and individuals, have never received a cent from the US government or its organization, but they are in jail, accused of the same crimes as other political prisoners. The truth is that all of them are in jail because they dare to defy publicly Ortega and Murillo, to denounce their crimes, to propose themselves as presidential candidates, to demand free elections, and to call on the people to peacefully oppose this dictatorship. I do not know much about funding by US organizations prior to 2018 or who their recipients were, but I never heard Ortega accusing AID or the National Endowment for Democracy of intervening in Nicaragua's internal affairs. The only thing I know is that much of the AID money for Nicaragua has been channeled through the government. I am fairly sure that if Ortega would allow for free and fair elections and lift the de facto state of emergency, relationships with the US would rapidly go back to where they were in 2017. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. So we will proceed to Margaret. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis, for that very detailed and knowledgeable exposition of what is happening in Nicaragua today. I had prepared a set of my own points. I'm not going to talk about all of them because you did it so much better, but I will say that I agree that the situation in Nicaragua is complex for the solidarity movement here in the United States. Sectors of that movement remain in solidarity with Ortega and Murillo, despite the facts that are absolutely evident of their crimes. And people from those sectors have countered my declarations, some in a spirit of healthy exchange, others confrontationally. As I understand them, their reasons, the reasons of those sectors of the left here in this country who continue to support Ortega and Murillo, fall into the following three categories. One, they say that Ortega and Murillo were part of the original Sandinista movement that ousted Somoza in 1979. The Sandinistas are revolutionaries, ergo Ortega and Murillo are revolutionaries. And they claim that Ortega's win in a succession of presidential elections shows that the majority of the Nicaraguan people support him. Two, they point to successful programs in education and infrastructure, which they say place the country above others in the region. And three, the United States is critical of the Nicaraguan government, and when the US is against the government, we should be for it. Those parts of the US left that defend the dictatorship argue that we must defend any government the US opposes. I would argue the following. One, Ortega and Murillo were indeed involved in the anti-Somoza struggle of the 1970s, and both of them held prominent positions in the Sandinista government that came to power in 1979. However, subsequent years brought rifts and divisions among the Sandinistas, with Ortega and Murillo consistently coming down on the side of authoritarianism and greed, and others, all imprisoned or exiled today, forming more democratic movements. I myself worked with Murillo in the early 1980s for almost a year at the Sandinista Cultural Workers Association, and I personally witnessed her harassment and humiliation of co-workers, her petty jealousies and voracious attempts to grab power. Once Ortega regained the presidency by aligning himself with the extreme right, he systematically eliminated all opposition, both within and outside his party. And today, all viable presidential candidates are either imprisoned or in exile, as Luis explained. The results of the November 7th electoral farce are, of course, a foregone conclusion, and even calling it an election, as Sergio Ramirez recently wrote, is an error in terms. 2, since the people's protests of April 2018, state terrorism under Ortega and Murillo has included more than 300 deaths, 150 political prisoners, the forced exile of tens of thousands, censorship of the media, the shutting down of more than 50 non-governmental organizations, and the elimination of all political opposition. The most important human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and the UN Human Rights Commission, have all denounced the current regime's flagrant human rights abuses, and these are indisputable facts. 3, in a country where Ortega has eliminated every potential opponent, an overwhelming vote for him cannot be seen as legitimate. And again, Luis explained that much better than I can. 4, there is one issue that I find particularly repugnant, and that is Daniel Ortega's sexual assault against his stepdaughter over a period of 19 years, beginning at age 11. At the time of Soy La America's 1998 press conference, I wrote a public letter condemning Ortega. I do not believe that a rapist should hold public office. I've been appalled that US leftists who call themselves feminists overlook this criminal behavior. And not even feminists, I mean, who call themselves humanists. Rosario Murillo defended her husband, abandoning her daughter. And while this may not constitute a crime, it's not a position that I can respect. 5, Nicaragua is a nation whose people endure poverty, repression, and out of control COVID pandemic. I understand that sanctions by other countries and international organizations may hurt the Nicaraguan people. We have the example of the egregious history of the 60-plus-year-old US blockade against Cuba that has been unable to defeat the Cuban Revolution, but has meant ongoing hardship for that country's people. So it's clear that sanctions can punish ordinary citizens rather than a regime. However, I do not believe there's an either-or solution to the issue of governmental power in Nicaragua. I believe we should denounce the United States whenever and wherever it interferes in the affairs of a sovereign nation, and at the same time call out the state terrorism orchestrated by the Ortega-Murillo regime. Ortega's extra-military thugs, the fact that all governmental branches, including the judiciary, are controlled by him, the murders, the torture, the kidnappings, the imprisonment without trials or access to legal defense, the complete electoral takeover and passage of arbitrary statutes used to justify such atrocities, while looking to the country's own civic organizations for leadership regarding how we on the outside may best help the Nicaraguan people achieve peace and equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Leonard?
I'm going to activate my mic. I'm going to refer first to some of the things that Luis said at the beginning, that I wanted just to talk about some things that I think are important to point out. And then a reflection that I want to make with you from someone that didn't participate in the revolution, doesn't remember the revolution, and has also a point of view that I think some people of my generation share about what we're living here, and also how what we're living today gave us some clues about the past. First of all, I want to say that I really believe that the actual government of Nicaragua doesn't represent a position of the left, or doesn't represent a movement from the left. One, first, because it's a government that is extremely extractivist in the way that they are managing the economy. The main project that the government has presented, like the future and hope of Nicaragua, it was the Interoceanic Canal, which is no longer viable, but it was the main project that they wanted to do. And with this project, pretty much they were giving in concession practically the whole country. Sounds like exaggeration, but if you read the law, it didn't have any limits. So pretty much they were giving in concession to a Chinese investor, potentially any territory in the country, to be able to create a interoceanic canal, despite many protests of the farmers that cover a great part of the territory. The other thing is that mainly the economy of Nicaragua right now is based in the exportation of meat to United States, and also the exportation of gold through different mine companies. So if you talk about what is the economy right now that the government of Nicaragua, this lefty government of Nicaragua is promoting, is actually a very conservative, extractivist economy, that it hasn't changed actually the levels of poverty, or has increased in a relevant way the quality of life of people, and also hasn't given people the tools to find new ways of progress. So I think this is important, because sometimes we talk a lot about the rhetoric of what this person says, of what the government is saying, but we don't talk actually about things that are really important, like the model of development that this government is building for Nicaragua. The other thing that I think is another proof that this government, it doesn't represent alternative for the left, is that the main enemies that have been characterized and identified by them are the feminist movement. If I had to put in a scale of what are the worst enemies of the government, I would say the feminist movement, which has been very consistent in their critique of how this government has pretty much destroyed the institutionality of the state and has promoted an agenda against women. And this rupture started, or I would say that the main rupture between the feminist movement and this government started with the accusation of Soy America, the daughter of the president, against him for rape. And in a moment that Ortega should have ended in prison, this created as an earthquake in the Sandinista party. And that was, I would say, one of the main divisions that they had at that moment. But a lot of people stay still with Ortega because women's rights violations were not reason enough to break relations with them. But the feminist movement was completely and absolute radical, and they said we're not tolerate that the leader of the revolutionary movement or revolutionary party actually was raping his own daughter for years. The other thing that also makes this government not representative of a lefty position is that it's a very religious government. They pretty much destroyed the separation between religious thought and government. They declare that the whole country is Christian, even though it's not like that. They are against abortion. They are against protection for LGBTQ communities. And also they have an agenda, well, they have a political structure that is based in the family of the president. So the wife is the vice president, and all and sons and daughters are the leaders of the different positions in the government. So one manage business, the other manage communication. So we are not talking even of a lefty movement. We are talking about a party/family control. So that is a completely different thing. Sometimes I don't understand how this is sometimes difficult to see for others, that we're talking that actually this government is based in the control of one family ruling overall. And that shouldn't be, like, don't even consider as a proposal that is valid for a movement from the left. The other thing that I think is really important to talk about is that this government is really pushing very successfully until now the creation of a new regime in Nicaragua. And even though they don't have they haven't made the changes or the transformations, all the ones that they want to do for the constitution, is a fact that we are living under a new regime. And when I say that we're living in a new regime, this means that we don't have access to free elections. So our right to select and vote for our leaders has been completely suppressed. That we are living in a regime in which the freedom of expression and the freedom of press, it doesn't exist as a right anymore. And this is not something that they hide. What I'm saying is that they are presenting this as the new reality. We are a new regime, that we're going to go to rule this country from this perspective, as the Nicaragua is just one. Nicaragua is just one Sandinista, and there is not a space for anything else. So we are living in this new system that has been created by them. And even though this new system is not reflected yet in all the institution and all the frame of the law, it is real and is existing. And their plan is that this is going to continue in a permanent way. So we are dealing with that perspective, which make us to be very difficult to be in a position of opposition to them, because we are not talking about the same frame. We are talking about a frame of democracy in which election exists, in which we have the right to talk and have difference and compete in the political arena. And they are talking about a completely different system that doesn't match with the idea of democracy. So right now, just to understand also how difficult is the situation, I think Luis said it, but I think it's important to stop and to think certain thing is that our opposition is completely beheaded right now. And this is not a small thing. I want you to understand how difficult this is for us. Our political leaders, all of them are in prison right now. And they are losing weight rapidly. I mean, we are talking that some people have lost 35 pounds in 3 months. We are extremely worried right now that our entire leadership could die in prison. And I'm not exaggerating, like I'm not saying something that we haven't been talking all the time. So sometimes when I talk with people from the left, from other countries, sometimes I feel that we are almost talking in different languages. And I feel a little bit ashamed being from the left, that other parts of the world and other organizations from the left and or other parts of the world don't see with clarity the level of destruction of human rights in Nicaragua. And we continue, I feel, in the same going around circles, that we have to continually explain people why this government is not from the left is one point. I'm happy to do it, but it's amazing that we still have to do it. But the other part is why we have to explain people that this government doesn't represent the left to be able to have a position against human rights violations. If Ortega certainly was the most amazing leader of the left, but continue killing people like they did in 2018, and they killed 325 people. And also if Ortega continue raping his daughter, and if Ortega continue having all political opposition leaders in prison, that will not save him from the responsibility, and that will not be excuse. What I'm saying is that not being a left, yes, a great argument, but also I think the left internationally in Latin America and United States, they have to take a stand in human rights. And that shouldn't be negotiable. And I think that should be in the center. And I say this to finish, because, for example, in my case, I was born in 1984. So when the peace came again in Nicaragua, I was 6 years old. I don't remember anything about the revolution. I don't have the emotional attachment that a lot of people has to the revolution, even though my parents were part of the revolution, and I grew up with a very positive idea of the revolution. But lately, with everything that happens in the country in the past, we start revisiting the past. We start really seeing what happened also in the revolution, because a lot of people that now we encounter left and right in the opposition, they are starting to share their stories of pain and human rights violation that they live in the 80s when they were in the opposite sides of the Sandinistas. So for us and for my generation, I think it's really important that we don't give this idea of black and white, that everything in the past was great, and this is not connected to what's happening today. For a lot of Nicaraguans, what is happening today is also connecting to a lot of atrocities that happened in the 80s. And I think it's great that and it's more interesting that we open a conversation that it says how we that belong to the left can become consistently a person that put human rights in the center. It doesn't matter if this is the dream of the left or this represents the hope of the left. If a movement, a man, a government don't respect human rights, shouldn't be an option, and we should support the people that is looking for freedom and protection in this context. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Leonard and Margaret and Luis for your interventions. So we're going to move now to some of the questions that have been posed. What I'd like to do is just maybe thread together a few patterns that I see, and then maybe have a couple of rounds. Also have a couple of questions, myself as somebody who tries to follow the developments in not only Nicaragua, but throughout the region. And of course, as William mentioned earlier, my particular area of focus is Venezuela, where many of these debates that you are describing also play out. But it seems, at least for the first round of questions, that there are three, and I would just to reiterate, invite attendees to pose your questions in the question and answer function of Zoom. So it seems like there's a first round of questions that basically break down into three as far as I can see. The first one, to some extent, Luis, you answered it, and Margaret, you did as well, but I just wanted to pose it again in case there's anything in addition that you want to add. And it has to do, yes, with the role of the United States. Not only the direct role, but perhaps indirect forms of pressure that the United States government, first under, as you mentioned, Luis, certainly under the Obama administration, the relations with Nicaragua were far more cozy than they became perhaps under Trump. And so, perhaps you could articulate a little bit more how the not univocal U.S. perspective or U.S. policy towards the region, especially, or towards Nicaragua, especially in the context, for instance, as you mentioned, Margaret, of sanctions, how that beyond the rhetoric actually has an everyday impact in shaping the political situation in Nicaragua itself. The second set of questions have to do a little bit, and Leonard was mentioning it in her comments, with the seeming disjuncture between the Ortega, certainly that people on the left or who cut their teeth with solidarity movements in Latin America with Nicaragua have of Ortega and of the Sandinista, of the sort of historic Sandinista movement in the 1970s and 1980s, and how that is so markedly different from the Ortega that we see, in the 2000s. And so could you explain in more detail what led to that, that vast gulf, or as Leonard is suggesting, perhaps there was, the gulf is not as wide. And in fact, it has more to do with the kind of papering over of tendencies that were already there in the 70s and 80s, as some of the questions have pointed out, and in fact have just flourished under a different context after Ortega returned to power. And then the third set of questions, again, in this first round, have a little bit more specific to do with the situation on the ground in Nicaragua. And in particular, having to do with the protests in 2018, several people have mentioned that the violence directed certainly by the state was not universally or at least exclusively directed by the state, and that there was violence that was perpetrated by some sectors of the opposition, which may be a fig leaf for some sort of rhetoric, but in fact, to what extent does this also factor into the larger debate playing out? So those are the three kind of levels: role of the U.S., the historical disjuncture of historical Sandinismo, and then the Somozas of today, and what led to that disjuncture, and then speaking a little bit more to the conditions on the ground that may, in some respects, lead to some levels of popularity for Ortega, even though they may not be majoritarian. And then we'll group that together, and then we'll come to a second round. Thank you.
My turn?
Why don't we start with Luis? Yeah, and then we'll go to Margaret, and then Leonard, if you have additional comments, please.
U.S. relations with Nicaragua and U.S. influence in Nicaraguan politics is not a simplistic one. As I said before, during these last years, those relations have changed over time. And hostility in a more visible way started in 2017 with the proposal of the so-called NICA Act. That was only approved in the beginning of 2018. At that time, by the end of 2017, Roberto Reyes, the head of the Electoral Council, was the only person to be sanctioned, and under the terms of the Global Magnitsky Act. As I said, up to that point, there were no main or more important contradictions, or open contradiction at least, between the U.S. government and the Nicaraguan, the Ortega's government. These things changed in 2018, clearly. And many people were sanctioned as a way to put pressure on the Ortega's government. The sanctions, though, did not affect the people of Nicaragua in any significant way. Sanctions were targeted to individuals, businesses that were involved in corrupt dealings, and belong to people very close to the FSLN, the Ortega's family, and to some institutions directly linked with repression, with political repression. But those sanctions didn't have any negative effects on the people. As a matter of fact, most of the people don't care about those. They are indifferent to that. And the government itself has said that during this year, the GDP has been growing and that the economic prospect is very positive. If sanctions were really so devastating as they claim them to be, that would not be happening. It's clear that so far, the means of the United States to put pressure on the Sandinista Ortega's government are not significant and are not significant and are not directed to an overthrow of the government. For that, they would need to support armed groups or impose real hard sanctions, which is not happening or which has not happened up to now. I firmly believe that pressures increased as a consequence of Ortega closing every political space, all political space in Nicaragua, as Ortega opposed all possibility for the opposition to run against him in free and fair elections. And that in the movement, there are right-wing, there are left-wing, there are non-partisan people, all of them fighting for democracy, struggling for democracy, and for the ousting of the dictatorship. But Ortega's politics have helped the right to gain preeminence in the opposition movement. Because Ortega, as well as the right-wingers, have tried to portray this conflict as a conflict between the right and the left for different reasons. The right one have that discourse, and Ortega has the same discourse. Through that, but also Ortega has always preferred to have as counterpart in any political negotiation or interaction the right-wing parties and the right-wing businessmen. He has always attacked the democratic left in Nicaragua, as I explained along my presentation. So there is an interesting, for lack of other word, relationship between the right wing and the opposition and the Ortega's government, and they feed themselves mutually in a political way. Plus, Ortega's criminal actions are giving the left a pretty bad name. I mean, people link his crimes, his abuses, his human rights violation with the left. So making it very difficult for the democratic left to increase their influence in the opposition movement. Well, I'll stay there.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Margaret, do you want to try to address some of the questions about the historical disjuncture between Sandinismo in the 70s, 80s, and what ended up happening, what led to this fissure, or not fissure, this transformation?
Well, I'll just say a few things. I really appreciated that, Leonard, that you brought up that aspect of not all the original Sandinistas were honest and trustworthy and so forth, that there were problems at that time that have continued. I would just suggest that, at least when I lived in Nicaragua, and I left in 1984, so this was just becoming more obvious when I left, but there were problems, and there were members of the Sandinista movement who committed crimes, who were certainly very misogynist. We've already pointed out Ortega's raping of his stepdaughter for so many years, and actually telling her that it was her revolutionary duty to submit to his will. That idea of revolutionary duty, I think, should stop a few people in their tracks. But I think that the difference was that when those people were discovered to be less than honest or trustworthy or less than revolutionary, it was basically on an individual basis. It wasn't a matter of a dictatorship or a family that has control of the entire country. So it's very different. But I think that your point is well taken, because I think that one of the things that led my generation into a lot of problems and into a lot of sectarianism was this absolute labeling. If you're Sandinista, if you're this or you're that, you're good. If you're imperialist or capitalist, etc., you're bad. And Luis addressed this just now too. I think that it's important to look at human rights at the center of everything. Should we have the right to assemble, to differences of opinion, to opposition, to free and fair elections, etc.? If you don't believe that we should have those rights, then maybe things are okay. But obviously, they're not. And I think that maybe it's more important to begin to look at things in terms of issues, in terms of the forces at work that influence people's lives, that control people's lives, than a simple label that you go to and you say, well, these people are good, these people are revolutionaries. And I think that Luis, what you just pointed out about how confusing that is for many people today, because they connect Ortega to traditional Sandinismo. I think that just shows that this is a problem.
Thank you, Margaret. Leonard, did you want to add?
Yes, continue to this interesting conversation. I think that, well, there are several questions here that I'm seeing. I think that one of the things that, for me, being someone from the left, but also being part of a country that's extremely polarized. And we have had not one, not two, but many wars because of this idea that the country has to be something or has to be the other one. The reason I mentioned also the thing about how we are revisiting the past in the Sandinistas, and that I hope this also is a reflection that can help to anyone that is from the left in the way we analyze other countries, is that the Sandinista party of the Sandinista movement was a part of a bigger movement that was the Nicaraguan revolution. The Nicaraguan revolution, the Sandinista movement was the biggest movement, and it has the armed forces. But it was not only the Sandinista party that was part of the Nicaraguan revolution. One thing that I think was a huge mistake that I think is important to reflect on is the fact that when the Sandinista got to power, they forget this was a national movement and they created a Sandinista revolution, that it has the best intentions in the world at the beginning, and it promised a big change, but it has two problems. One is that it was a structure in a military structure. So that it means that it was different, very different, that something that it has a military hierarchy will become a democratic movement like this, very difficult. Also having United States attacking you, we know that. But this is an important concept because this is the concept that remains with Ortega. The difference in that is there were a lot of people involved in this. So there were a lot of forces, and there were some saying, no, let's not do this. Others were saying, yes, let's do this. But for example, just to give you an example, how we accepted in that moment that it was okay that the army was considered the Sandinista army, or that the police was considered the Sandinista police. Why we think it was okay to be credited that the country has to be just one. That is a big problem. And that's the rhetoric that Ortega has today. That Nicaragua can only be one, can only be Sandinista. So everybody else that is not Sandinista, not from the left, Sandinista or Orteguista, it doesn't have a space in the country. And as someone from the left, one of the things that I fight more is the right for alternates in power. And I think that is the only thing that is going to take us to have a peaceful and democratic country, that in some point we have to really acknowledge there is not one answer, no one country, that the only way that we find a peaceful solution to our problems that we accept that we are a diverse country, very complex, with the right to have different political views, and that the people from the right are not our enemies. So I like to expand this in consideration when we think about this country, and when we also reflect on what happened in the past and what happens today. And yeah, my comment was more in that direction. I just want to say finally that talking specifically about 2018, that this was a national rebellion. I saw it with my eyes. I was surprised as anyone else. I know because I have make documentaries about the people, all the young people that were in the protest at the beginning, that organized and called everybody else to go to the streets. This was an spontaneous, completely chaotic movement that was the result of years of political repression that leave us with no space for, political incidents, for political participation. Luis mentioned it. We didn't have the people in the Congress. We couldn't because they banished them. We didn't have political parties because they destroyed them. We didn't have any way to communicate and have an influence to the government. So when we have these two things that got together, it was the fire in this reserve and also the reform to the social security. It was like people just explode because they didn't find another way. This nothing is related at all with any influence of US in Nicaragua. Because honestly, also, I think US is not that worried about Nicaragua. They have a very uncomfortable, very stable relationship with Ortega. They have great collaborations with the army to prevent that the migrants go to the border because that's the agenda they share. They have collaboration in many aspects. The government received a lot of money from the United States for development projects. So I just want to point out that you have to believe that this was a national spontaneous rebellion that was the result that the government killed 28 students in 4 days. And it's something that Nicaragua doesn't accept, is that you kill students in Facebook, and everybody saw it at the same time. So that was the thing that triggers. That was the thing that made everything explode. The fact we didn't have any space to, communicate our voice or have an incident, and also that the government killed 28 students in front of us. In everybody saw it in social networks. So that was it. After that, everybody got together, even the people that were Orteguistas and Sandinistas. At that moment, we all came together.
Alejandro, I'd like to jump. I'd like to say something. So I want to speak to this issue of, of U.S. sanctions and supposed U.S. intervention, because what the regime is doing and its supporters inside Nicaragua, but more significantly in the left in Latin America and in the United States, is talking about sanctions with the image that this is something that what we see in Venezuela, what we see in Cuba. Venezuela and Cuba, whatever you think of those governments or those revolutions is not relevant. The point is that those countries are under a total siege by the United States. They can't trade, they can't get international credit, they can't do anything. Nothing like that in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, there are no trade sanctions. As Luis pointed out, business is booming between the United States and Nicaragua. Nicaragua in late 2020, early 2021, just received several hundreds of millions of dollars in credit from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Agency. What the sanctions are, and they only are, is that your personal bank accounts in the United States are frozen. And we have to ask, why would someone who claims to be a revolutionary, a Sandinista revolutionary, have millions of dollars in personal bank accounts in the United States if you're not a corrupt, nepotistic capitalist? And that's what's being sanctioned. I don't support those sanctions. I don't support any U.S. intervention anywhere in the world. But we have to put that into perspective. The National Endowment for Democracy, it's true that it spent a few millions of dollars in financing Nicaraguan opposition organizations, but it spent more money in U.S. allies throughout Latin America. The biggest recipient of National Endowment for Democracy funding in Latin America is Colombia, the country most aligned with the United States. Honduras and Guatemala has gotten more money combined from the NED than has Nicaragua, as Luis pointed out. The Agency for International Development, the AID, until 2018, gave several hundreds of millions of dollars to the Ortega government. So we have to be clear when we talk about these sanctions and this intervention and cut through the propaganda of the regime and its supporters abroad. And I want to conclude with one other, I want to say one other thing about this. The regime has a propaganda machinery, and it's very powerful, and it knows how to manipulate international left perspectives and opinions. And it has its supporters here that I've read their articles all the time. Here it circulates all over the media here in the United States, the left media. And when you pick it apart, you see that it's the crudest of propaganda. This is passing off as journalism. And I give one example here. There's every single, it's self-referential. They write one article, these people that support the regime and say that it's revolutionary and the US are trying to overthrow it. They write one article, then they write a second one citing the first, then they write a third article fighting their own articles of the first and the second, then they write a fourth. So it's all self-referential. And all of these articles, you see them citing this article published by a second-rate US sociologist whose name is Benjamin Waddell. He's from Fort Lewis College. He's an insignificant, I'm a sociologist. He's an insignificant sociologist that studies transnational migration. He went down to Nicaragua in 2018. He happened to time his visit with the popular insurrection. And he's anti-Sandinista, that's his business. And so he wrote an article saying the NED laid the foundation for this insurrection to overthrow the government. He's nobody. He's not an official from the US government. He's not an official from AID, from NED, from the State Department. He's a sociologist like I am. And he wrote this article. And he published it in this online publication called Global Americans. Global Americans is not a US government publication whatsoever. I can submit an article and publish it there. I don't know if they publish it because they're not leftists, it's conservative. But now this article that this second-rate sociologist wrote in a non-governmental, simply news outlet gets endless coverage as proof, in quotes, proof that 2018 was an attempted coup d'etat by the United States. So that's how this propaganda machinery works. And the left in the United States and internationally really needs to be more intelligent in looking at what's going on and in being able to evaluate information coming out of Nicaragua, coming out of the United States, and so forth. So yeah, that's why I wanted to jump in on that.
Oh, good. William, thank you.
I want to say something else.
Look, one second, Luis. It's just that there's a lot of questions.
Okay.
And I want to see if we can get to some of them because people have been very patient in their responses. So there's another set of questions that I think grouped together. One I think speaks a little bit to Leonard's point about, and also what you mentioned, Margaret, about highlighting or making central the role of human rights and thinking about left activism today. But there's a series of questions here. Certainly in the United States, there's a debate as to what constitutes human rights. And there's a sense of a split between social and economic rights on the one hand would tend to be sidelined and pushed aside, especially in US discourse, which privileges civil and political rights like the ones that you mentioned, assembly, protest, etc., freedom of speech, etc., etc. So a couple of related questions, in what ways, for instance, are some of the social and economic achievements either of the Sandinista revolution or more recently, have those remained or not remained? And in what ways does that therefore count as a critique, right, of the Ortega government? And how then do we think about a human rights framing that isn't exclusively centered on civil and political rights, but also upholds what has been a historic legacy of left movements in Latin America and elsewhere, which is the primacy of social and economic rights as well? So that's one set of questions, and I guess I just wanted to highlight those. The other one comes a little bit out of what William was mentioning in terms of media and propaganda. And there's a concrete question here, which is, are there reliable sources that people on the left or more generally can, that you would point to them to be able to get access to information or analysis on Nicaragua from Nicaragua itself? Number one, but number two, sort of an inverse of that, to William's point, is some of the kind of some of the more propagandistic sort of dimensions of the Nicaraguan crisis abroad, do they then recirculate back in Nicaragua? And do Nicaraguans consume some of this information coming from abroad as well? And then how does that shape the political and social landscape? And then a third set of questions, and I have this question as well, so I'd like to insist on it, which is it remains a little bit unclear, what accounts for that seeming shift from, again, 70s, 80s Sandinismo to Ortega, circa 2008 and since, right? It's I think for people on the left, again, who cut their teeth in the solidarity movement of the 70s and 80s, it's difficult to parse. So what accounts for this transformation, or is it a transformation? So if you could at least try to give that another go. And then finally, there's a series of questions in the chat about what can be done, especially in a context where it is possible, as you mentioned, Luis, that that a very right-wing conservative government, the way that we sort of understand it, might come to power. If there's a vacuum or something was left in that place. So how then to thread that needle between opposing the violations that are happening under Ortega without also then laying the groundwork for an eventual, perhaps something, a worse alternative down the road.
Many questions, Alejandro. Which one we start?
With whichever one you want, and you could just take one and then leave the others to Margaret and Luis.
Someone wants to start?
Why don't you start, Leonard, since you were the last one in the previous round?
Okay, I can start with the human rights questions. I think it's a super relevant question to define what is human rights and what is the relevance that in a political discussion, right? For me right now, that I feel that honestly, I have lost all my political rights. I cannot even enter my country. And I cannot enter my country because I have these kind of conversations with you, because I made a documentary with the testimony of the daughter of Ortega, which in a democracy will be very annoying for power, but it will not be a threat for my life. It will not be a risk for me. So the thing is that if we don't have human rights, we cannot have a frame to even compete in political arena. So what happened in Nicaragua is that what are the persons that the government has treated with as enemies? First place, feminists, then the farmers movement, because the farmer movement was against the interoceanic canal. The farmers movement are the ones that produce the food in Nicaragua. And the lands that were in danger of being lost with this canal were the lands that are used to grow our food. So these people were saying, hey, let's talk about, food security in Nicaragua. Let's create a system that works for everybody. But this conversation, it was impossible. The feminists were saying, hey, let's talk about violence in Nicaragua, how we are going to have same rights for women and men in this country. But we cannot have this conversation. Why? Because literally right now, we don't have the right to have political organization. We don't have the right to enter our own country. We don't have the right to participate in elections. So the thing is that if we don't have human rights, we cannot have an honest, equal, and fair fight for power. And it's really making us asking this horrible question that I want you to ask yourself as well. When you ask me what we can do to support the country is how we can get free elections with a government that is completely obsessed in his position. How we a peaceful movement can we recover democracy when the person in power has the power over guns? That is the very difficult question for us. And I want you to think about it because we don't have an answer for that. And for a lot of people, that's the really difficult thing about saying no to the United States, because who is helping us? Who is helping us to fight someone that has the power of guns? And we don't want a war. We learned that lesson. We don't want a war. We don't want that suffering for the country. And we are not going to do it because no one is looking for that. But how we do that. So that is for me the importance of human rights. How we are going to talk even about food security, women's rights, if we don't have the ability to communicate with power.
Thank you, Leonard. Margaret?
Yeah, I just think that the, differentiating between one type of human right and another type of human right is really, it's the wrong way to look at it. I mean, human rights are human rights. I remember during the Second World War when this famous quote by Niemöller, when he said, they came for the communists and I wasn't a communist, so I wasn't worried. They came for the Jews and etc. And when they came for me, there was no one left to stand up. I mean, human rights are simply the rights of rights of all humans. So it's got to include economic rights, food security, health rights, access to education and healthcare, the right to live in a safe society against violence against women, against violence against LGBTQ people, etc., etc. So it's got to be everybody's rights. And as Leonard just pointed out, I mean, if you can't even be in your country, then what rights do you have? So I think it's got to be looked at as a total problem that includes all of these rights and not, partition off, some are economic rights, some are social rights. I think those distinctions are counterproductive, and that's really all I wanted to say about that.
Can you address I'm sorry to insist, but can you address the point about sort of the transformation of Ortega? Because several people have asked that repeatedly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that probably, Luis, go ahead.
Well, I want to address several questions. Somebody asked about violence on the part of the protesters in the 2018 rebellion. And it is true. There were various incidents of violence from the protesters. But this is not surprising. In any popular movement, there are anarchic forces, there are even thugs and delinquents that going through and some themselves add themselves or participate in the movement, and but that doesn't define the character of the movement. The person who asked the question says there were weapons. I think there were some weapons, a few weapons, mostly in the hands of people who were Sandinistas who turned around during that time and were used to using violence as a way to impose their will. But they didn't represent the spirit and the political position of the whole of the movement. In, I don't know, in the protests for Black Matters Life in the United States, there was looting. But you would not make responsible the people who are promoting the protests and the marches for that looting. It's the same happened in Nicaragua, and that doesn't alter the nature of the movement. Someone asked about reliable sources. Well, I only can think right now of Confidencial, which is a serious media outlet, probably the most serious media outlet in Nicaragua, and source of for many and a good source of information of what's happening there. You said how to what accounts for the shift? Okay, I cannot. I don't have a complete explanation, but I can say a few things. It is true that democracy wasn't in the ideological matrix of the Sandinista front. We were a revolutionary movement, and we didn't care very much about democracy. That is why the things that Leonard was saying about the Sandinista and the army and the police, and we really wanted in the end that everybody was a Sandinista in Nicaragua and acted like that. So there is an original thing, I would say, that many of us I'm a loss of word, that many of us recognized this this lack and this deficit in the Sandinista ideological and political perspective. And that's why after the 1990, many of us went to create a new organization that would cherish the principles of the revolution, but with a democratic perspective. So we created the Democratic Left in Nicaragua. Ortega became the sole owner of the FSLN. The FSLN was destroyed as a political party. There are no directive board. I mean, the only voice, the only decisions that matter are the ones taken by Ortega and his wife. And he secured his control of the party and made it into an instrument of his own interests. But also there was the money thing. I mean, I think Ortega increased their greed and their want of money, and was lured also by the possibility of earning or getting a lot of money through political power. And he was involved in a corrupting process that made him into a dictator, because he needs power to keep his wealth, and that was increased tenfold by the appropriation of the Venezuelan aid to Nicaragua. So I think the original thing plus a thirst for power. He is power crazed. He and his wife are power crazed, and they have always put that in the center of their political objectives, especially after 1990. And third is money. The third is the possibility to become rich. And he is a very rich man, and they are a very rich family. And power is determinant for keeping that money. There was another question about threading the needle. Remind me.
Oh, between, how can people on the left, or just generally abroad, who oppose what's happening under the Ortega government, oppose what's happening under the Ortega government without also then laying the groundwork for, perhaps a more right-wing government to take power under the guise of defending democracy or promoting freedom, etc.
Let me say this. If we had a right-wing democratic government instead of Ortega, I would be glad. Because if we have democracy, we could struggle for more just social and economic policies, where we could organize the people to put pressure on the government. We could more freely put out our ideas and our programs for a more just and Nicaragua. So we could use democracy to push for our programs, our political programs. That we cannot do with Ortega in power. That we cannot do when you have a dictatorship that crushes everything and that doesn't allow any dissension, any criticism, not even within their own rank and file. They just expelled a judge that committed the error of receiving a demand from the one of the parties that was banned, and the next day they throw him out. They went into his house. They took his passport, and he was a loyal Sandinista for so many years. So nobody, and if you cannot dissent, if you cannot discuss, if you cannot put your ideas forward, if you cannot do any of that, then there is no future for a democratic left. So I think that a democratic right-wing government is not worse than a so-called left dictatorship as Ortega's.
I guess the key there would be whether it's a democratic one, right? I mean, could easily have a non-democratic right-wing government.
Of course.
So, I'm sure an ideal world would be, what we'd all want, but that's maybe not sound on the pill. Go ahead, William.
Yeah, I'll make this quick, but I want to go back to the issue that human rights are not just political rights, but they're also social and economic and cultural rights. And as a matter of course, but when we say that, there might be some listening to this to think, oh, so Ortega is repressing political human rights, but he's meeting the socioeconomic human rights of the Nicaraguan population. But that is totally and completely false. Let's remember when the maquiladora workers went out on strike for higher wages, Ortega sent the police in to crack their heads open. When the campesinos were being displaced to a billionaire Hong Kong canal developer, they were put in jail. They were beaten by the police and the army and put in jail. The original spark for the 2018 uprising was the government was lowering pensions that workers were going to get and raising the contributions that they had to make. You would never know by listening to this official discourse that Nicaragua has one of the worst income distribution in all of Latin America. And according to the World Bank, Nicaragua has the lowest wages in all of Latin America. So this regime is not defending social and economic rights of Nicaraguans. It's violating them systematically together with the political repression, the violation of political human rights.
Just want to
Thank
mention.
you, William. So we are actually over time, but let me do the following. Let me ask all of you to give some final remarks, and I will just pose this because I think it would be a good good way to, you know, to end a discussion with a series of questions that have come up, which is again have to do with, you know, concrete ways of support from the United States in particular, and from the left in this moment. Thank you.
Well, I just have a couple of things to say there. I would just say that we need to take leadership from the organizations, the repressed organizations inside of Nicaragua. UNAMOS, I know that they can't speak, that they have no space for action, but I think we still have to take their direction in terms of what we can do, the left on the outside, because they're the ones who have a sense of what's going on there from day to day, you know. So I think that that's where we need to take our direction.
Margaret. Luis or Leonard?
I can say, well, I think the most important and crucial agenda right now is we have to set the political prisoners free. Because right now, any effort that we have of changing the country, organizing ourselves, representing the voices of Nicaragua are completely shut down by the fact that our political leaders are in prison. And that doesn't represent only a human violation for them, which are led in horrible conditions. They are just giving food one a day. They don't have anything to cover themselves. They are interrogated 3-4 times a day. They have lights on all the time. They're pretty much being tortured psychologically. And we are really fear that our political opposition's leaders are going to die in jail. So I will say that that is our more priority agenda. And it would be great if you use your voice first to spread the truth about the myths that are around the government of Ortega. Also remember that we are a left. There exists a left in Nicaragua that is not the Sandinista party, that is not Ortega. The problem is that we have been dealing with a government that systematically has taken ownership of the left political spectrum in Nicaragua and has made pretty much to every political party that is from the left in Nicaragua life impossible. Like Luis can tell you, the pretty much half of their companions in the political party are in prison right now. So, but there is a left, there is a strong movement in Nicaragua that is opposition of Ortega, that is composed by the feminists, the farmers, the journalists, the environmentalists, the artists, that we believe that the world is an injustice place, and that is important that the government and political movements do create political policies to help to have an equality in the world and equality in a country. And we are progressives and we live in human rights and women's rights. So the problem is that Ortega pretty much have kidnapped what it means to be left. So don't spread that. Please work against that myth. We are people that we are progress fighting Ortega. And also we need to set free our political prisoners. So any effort in that direction will be really appreciated.
Thanks, Leonard.
Yeah.
And just quickly, can you say where people can watch your film?
Sure, I can write it here. And just, mawis.com. Okay, I'm going to write it right now in the chat. My film is Exile.
Yeah, I think the chat is disabled, but why don't you send it to me and then I will make sure that we post it when we post the video later. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Luis.
Okay, a few things. First of all, help us dispel the lies that Ortega's government is spreading around about some of the things that we have been discussing here. Also, denounce as hard as you can all human rights and violation of all the democratic and political rights of the people in Nicaragua. Help us convince everybody that these elections are completely farcical, that they are no elections at all. There's no competition, that there is no opposition, that this is a one-party election. That is very important because the so-called international community, some countries in the international community have been putting out harsh speeches and declarations, but we don't really see that is a determination to really not recognizing the Ortega's government that is going to be in power for the next years. I mean, we don't see yet that the foreign governments are really willing to take such a political measures with the Ortega government. So we need some help so that to expose the truth about these elections. Also, I think you could help exiles in the United States. Many people are going there, and they are, many of them are suffering very difficult situations. Just recently, Nairobi Olivas, who was one of the young, was very symbolic, his cheerful and firm attitude when he was imprisoned, and was very moralizing to everybody. But he's now spent several months in a reclusion center in, I think, North Carolina or South Carolina, I don't know exactly where. But there are many others, and they need a hand to help them to go through the bureaucratic processes and for getting a right to stay in the United States. That is also important. Those are some of the things that I think you could do to help us. And I would take up what Leonard said about the political prisoners. The thing is that they really might be in danger, at least some of them, because of the appalling conditions in which they are being held. And this fierce isolation in which they are kept will probably have long-term psychological and physical consequences on them. These are innocent people. These have not taken up arms. These people have not promoted a coup or armed struggle against the dictatorship. They are real democratic fighters demanding freedom and justice. That's who they are, and they deserve all the support, all the solidarity that we can give them. To the prominent ones and to the rest that are already in the prisons of Ortega. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luis, and thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Leonard. And we're going to close with some comments from William.
Yeah, well, I'll just say a couple of things by way of conclusion. The Nicaragua is going to remain in the headlines. The elections, or the farcical elections, are set for November 7th. So this issue isn't going anywhere. It's going to get a lot tougher. The crisis is going to deepen. And so this remains, for me, a tremendous challenge to the left in the Americas, really, and worldwide. How do we approach this issue of Nicaragua? So, I mean, I'll leave it open-ended at that, but I want to thank our panelists. But in addition, I want to thank you, Alejandro, and I want to thank NACLA for co-sponsoring this event.
No, thank you for bringing it to us, and thank everyone for attending. As I mentioned before, we have recorded this event and we will post it hopefully in the next day or two onto the NACLA YouTube site, but it will circulate as well, I am certain, through all the other networks. So thank you, everyone. Good night. Ciao.
Thank you all, and good night.